not just the God of the mountains. And it's a lot of fun to live in the mountains.
Yes.
I mean, that's where I'd like to live. You know, look down on smog and enjoy wonderful trees and what have you. But you know what? He's God of the valley also. He's God of the day. He's God of the night. God is God. And what a wonderful understanding that we have when we realize that He is God of everything. Now this is called life. And life sometimes can be wearisome. How many believes that? Yeah, we're going to talk about that this morning. Galatians 6 and 9. In fact, we're going to read the 10th verse too. Galatians 6 and 9. Life can be very pleasant, and as Paul said earlier, tomorrow may change that. You know, we don't know exactly, but we do know that the Lord doesn't change. We may change and circumstances change, but He changes not. So Paul, if anybody had a right to be weary, wore out, stressed out, frustrated out, it was the Apostle Paul. But he writes words of encouragement to you and I. And let us not be weary in well-doing. For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. So let's take a look at this and see if this doesn't help you and I in our, not just in our living, but in our walk with the Lord. He starts off with, and let us not be weary in well-doing. We have control. The word let means don't allow. Don't allow yourself to be so weary, so worn out, so out of control that you can't do what God wants us to do. We can't be what God wants us to be. We have control of our attitudes, our work habits, and faithfulness in well-doing. It is up to us. It is our choice. What we can't do, Christ can do through us. Well-doing takes effort. It takes strength. Well-doing takes faith. And most of all, dependence on Jesus Christ. We must depend upon Jesus Christ for us to do well. Jesus went about doing well. And He wants you and I to go about doing well. You see, anybody can sit down and do nothing. Anybody can do that. But it takes a man, woman, boy, or girl with grit, determination, and a trust in the Lord to be able to continue against all odds. To do that which is good. We get wary when we focus on unimportant things. And sometimes that unimportant thing is what? Feel sorry for yourself.
Sure.
Now, I don't know anything here, know anything going on, but I want us to understand that, and this message was in the making over a month ago when I put it in the bulletin, lay the groundwork for it. But we, that's you and I, what causes us to get wary? Ready to throw our hands up. Well, it happened to Jeremiah. Everywhere Jeremiah went to preach good news that would help the nation from the judgment, not necessarily from the judgment of God, but how to get through. I believe that Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children paid attention to what he said. Because they were carried off. But Jeremiah, it seemed like, preached nothing but gloom and doom. Finally put into a pit. The religious folks were against him. The political folks were against him. The nation as a whole was against him. He finds himself in a pit. All he done, he didn't break the law. He didn't steal anything. He didn't burglarize. He didn't murder. He didn't break the law. All he done was irritated a few folks with the truth.
That's true.
And that seems to be enough even in our day and time. But Jeremiah finally said, Lord, I've had it with you. I'm not going to preach anymore. Every time I get a group together, I end up being beaten. I end up being rejected. I end up in a pit. I'm tired of it. I quit. Go get somebody else. I'm not going to do it anymore.
Bless him, Lord.
Then he said, oh, but I can't keep from doing it. The truth of God is like a fire built up in my bones. And I can't quit, Lord, doing what you want me to do. I don't believe he's just talking about ministry. I think he's talking about every one of us. Sometimes we find ourselves in a pit lamenting over our situations, but I want you to know that there's something inside that will not let us quit. Something inside that burns like a fire. Now, when you get the fire in the bones, you got some heat. You got something there that you can't extinguish. You can't put any cold ice on it. It's in the bones. It's going to be there. You just have to keep on keeping on. Don't you? Well, we get focused on unimportant things. Look at the children of Israel. They began to focus on what the nations that they were to conquer could do instead of what God could do. Look at all those who buckled under the pressure. Living for Christ, again, is not for sissies. And some folks, at times, we feel like buckling. But you know what? We can't do it, regardless of the pressure. So what do? How are we to take care of this? Well, the Lord has built in exercises. How do I strengthen myself? How do I go about making myself strong enough to meet the task that is in front of us? How do you attack what's in front of you? How do you build the stamina? How do you have the strength at times to do it? Well, we got an Olympics about ready to go on in a few days. And I will guarantee you that folks are not just going to show up there. That folks have been working on this for years. And there's probably time after time, day after day, night after night, that some of them that will have never made it have thrown their hands up. But those that stuck to the task have the strength for the competition, don't they? Well, the Lord has built something for us. And hand me that tablet there, would you, Brother Tony? I forgot I got some scriptures written on that. And I tore this out and made copies. Oh, everybody's got a copy. Thank you. Listen to what James has to say. James 1 and 2. Now, it don't make sense unless you understand God's viewpoint of it. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations or into different types of trials. When things don't go right. When things just seem to work against you. Now, I'm going to say something here this morning, and I don't mean to embarrass anyone, but I do want to give a witness to this here. Nobody here probably understands exactly what all Brother Johnny and Sister Linda have went through in the last 3 or 4 months. But you talk to them, and you wouldn't know that they were going through anything. And God's blessing them, and God's touching them, and God's bringing forth something that they have been trying to do for months, but it's working out. And they keep testifying. God, I've heard words from them, testimonies from them, and again, I don't want to embarrass them. But, well, we prayed, and God's, God's taking care of it, what have you. And if it doesn't happen, I've heard this from them. If it doesn't happen, then that's okay too. God's still God. Isn't that wonderful?
Yes, it is.
To live life like that. My brethren, count it all joy. How many of us can say, and I don't want to put us on the spot, I think most of us can, if not all of us. But there are times that we're weak, and we may not be able to say it. How many of us this morning can say, wow, isn't it wonderful? I'm going through a trial. Isn't it wonderful? Things just seem to be falling apart. Isn't it wonderful that I get to talk to God and His joy is going to consume me? That'd be about like the Apostle Paul and Silas said, isn't it wonderful? We just got beat to a rag or whatever. We just got beat down. We're in shackles. It we didn't do. Isn't it wonderful? Well, that's what they said. Lord, this is wonderful. I feel your joy. I feel something in my bones because I'm going through a trial. This brings me closer to you, Lord. Count it all joy when you fall into these different trials. Why do we count it all joy? Because the next verse sums it up. Knowing this, having this understanding, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. And if you read on down through there, you'll see what all else it does. But it starts out, it gives us patience. Don't expect God to do things as quickly as you want them done. Why? Because He's building something within you and I. And then, now does anybody have a right to say that? James is the only one of the disciples that didn't die a tragic death. Or pardon me, that was John. James was killed along with the other disciples. Every one of the disciples except John the Beloved, and they tried to boil him in oil to death. But all these others, he's facing persecution. He's facing death. Why? Because he's preaching the truth. Why? Because he's writing what the Lord, the Holy Ghost, has given him. And then he said, I'm going through trials. Sometimes we think that all these wonderful heroes of the Bible never ever went through anything. Well, study out and see what all they went through. And then Peter, who according to tradition was crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy to be crucified this way, because he had betrayed the Lord. Here's what he says: that the trial or the testing of your faith, has your faith ever been tested? Don't buckle under it if it's being tested. That the trial of your faith, well, Peter knew that his faith was tested. It was put to the test. And he realized he had buckled. But he also realized the Lord had come and restored him. And now then, it had never buckled again. That's right. He stood like a tall oak tree. That the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold, that perisheth at temporal things, though it be tried with fire. Man, if you're going to be tried with fire, I'd rather be tried with marshmallows or Jell-O or anything but fire. Might be found unto praise and honor. Now listen to what he said. I want you and I to grasp this here. Because James and Peter are on the same page. All the disciples were on the same page with this here. That the trial of your faith being much more precious, the trial of it is precious. The testing of our faith is precious. More precious than that of gold. What does that mean? That means instead of living a life of comfort, that's what gold can do, is to produce for you and I a life of comfort. It can buy us things. But he said that the testing of our faith is much more precious than the comfort that gold will buy. Though it be tried with fire, even though your faith is tried with fire, might be found. Here's what our faith needs to be found. When the test is going on, how many likes to find the results of a test after it is completed? Well, when the test is over, what are we going to find? He said, be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. Wow. Our faith just plows right on through. Heat it up, it'll plow through. Try to flood it, it'll plow through. Try to destroy it, our faith just plows right on through. Why? Because we know that it honors, it praises, honors, and glorifies the Lord. Your faith, my faith, gives honor to the Lord. Do you realize that? Especially when it goes through a test. That's kind of like when God said about Job, have you considered my servant Job? He's been tested. He made it through the test. Everything in the world that could happen to him, disaster, happened, and yet he made it. He came forward. He said it himself. He said, I don't know what's going on. I don't understand this testing. I don't understand what's happening here. You know, my friends have lined up to criticize me and tell me I got sin in my life. My wife tells me to curse God and die. And he said, my body aches. I got boils all over me. And I lost my children. I've lost everything I have. But he said this right here. But there's one thing for certain. When I come forth, I shall come forth as pure gold. I don't know what's happening here. I'm going to leave that up to God. You know, sometimes we try to figure out what's happening to us. God may say it's none of your business. You just trust me. You just trust me. I'll bring you through this here. Give honor, praise, and glory to me. And everything else will be all right. These are the ones that were under pressure. But you know what? The Bible is full of those that are under pressure. And you know what? They succeeded because of their faith and confidence in God. Well, there's some spiritual exercises that build strength. Doing nothing brings deterioration or weakness. You realize that? You know why so many people are weak? Especially those that even claim to be Christians are so weak, is because they don't do anything. They have no exercise going. Well, what do I do? How do I? Those who compete must exercise. Do you know you and I are competing today? Satan wants your soul. That's what Jesus said to Peter. Satan hath desired to sift thee as wheat, but I pray for your faith. He wants you, Peter, but I pray for your faith. We're competing for our very souls. And those who compete must exercise. Well, how do I spiritually exercise? A spiritual exercise is loving. Sometimes loving the unlovable. Faithfulness is a great exercise. Trust is a great exercise. Prayer is a great exercise. Being able to forgive is a great exercise. Being obedient to God's will is a great exercise. I'm feeling stronger this morning just reading these things. There's several others, but I just thought of these here. Obedience, work, laboring for the Lord, doing something for the Lord, giving, etc. Find out what exercises your spiritual life. Doing nothing just deteriorates, and we have no strength at all to fight against the wiles of the devil. We find ourselves weak and unable to face each day. Doubts began to creep in. Discouragement begins to creep in. Why? Because we fail to exercise those things that God has told us to exercise in. Remember, God's promises are for the trustworthy. God's promises are not for the untrustworthy. They're for the trustworthy. I want us to go to Joshua 23 and 14. What a wonderful man of God. He had just previously let us know what a parent he was. Choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my household, we will serve God. He didn't say if, no ifs in it. If it works out, if everything's okay. But now, after that, he was an old man when he made that statement. They had already won the promised land. When he makes that statement, now he's getting ready to depart. How wonderful for a man to face his life's departure in this way. Listen to what he said. 14th verse, 23rd chapter. And behold, this day. Now, prior to this, he had called all the leaders of Israel in. He had invited anybody that wanted to come. And he's going to make his final speech. And behold, this day, I am going the way of all the earth. He said, I'm dying. What a way to depart. Old age is taken over. I've entered into old age. But I'm facing tomorrow with an understanding of how good God's been to me. And behold, this day I'm going the way of all the earth. And you know in all your hearts, if you don't know this, you need to learn this. In all your hearts and in all your souls, that not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you. What a way to depart, addressing the leadership and the families of Israel and saying, listen, go back and take notice of what God has done. You don't have a right to complain. You don't have anything to stand on today about why things are not the way you think they ought to be. Not one thing. Your heart knows it. Your soul knows it. Not one thing has God kept back from His promises that He promised you. Joshua's not complaining about being old and decrepit. He's still addressing, his spirit is addressing a very powerful and awesome praise and glory and honor to the Lord. Not one thing has He failed. God ever failed you in, which the Lord your God spake concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, and not one thing hath failed thereof. Joshua is saying, I want you to know, for one, I'm declaring that God has been faithful to His promises. Have there been battles? Yes. Have there been discomforts? Yes. Has there been times that we just didn't know what to do? Yes. But God has not failed in one area.
Amen. That's right.
Everything He promised has come to pass. We're in the land He promised. It does flow with milk and honey. No enemy that has come against us has ever been able to defeat us. Have there been battles? Yes. Have there been storms? Yes. But you know what? God has not failed in one area. Your heart knows that.
Right.
And your soul knows that. You know what we need to do is take time, you and I, and review all the things God has done for us. If we're in a place that we're questioning God, we need to go back and begin to take a reference viewpoint. We need to come back and take and acknowledge what God has done for us in the faith. Maybe things are not just right now. But God said He would never leave us nor forsake us.
Right.
Amen.
That's right.
Lo, I'm with you always. Joshua understood God in every phase of his life and in his family. And then we get to this due season. You see, be not weary in well-doing, for in due season. In due season. Well, when is that due season? Well, it's not right now, we know that. It's God's season. God declares the season. Don't expect, when you plant a seed, for it to come up tomorrow and you're going to harvest. As we plant seeds, we will reap in due season. You see, a man that works for a company does not receive his retirement until he retires. What would you think of somebody going in and saying, well, I want my retirement? And that's the way we do God at times. Well, God, I served you, I got saved, now I want everything here, just put it in my bank account. Well, the due season for a retirement is when you retire.
Good point.
And when we retire, then that may be the new season God has for you and I. It may not be till we get to heaven. It may be tomorrow. It may be next month. I don't know. God's the one that sets that season up. And then, remember what He said on that. He said for us to, if we faint not, we're going to reap. Remember, this is God's Word. There will be a harvest if we faint not. If we don't just throw our hands up and give up, God has got a payday, a harvest for us. If we don't expect God to do everything immediate, because we'll get discouraged if we do. We turn it over to God, it's up to Him. Take a look at those who endured. God came to Abraham and Sarah. He's 75 years old. He says, Abraham, you're going to have a son. Then he didn't hear from God for 24 more years. And then it was another year after that when he had a son. 25 years later, Abraham lived with the promise of God that he was going to have a son. He just said, all God said was, be faithful. Be faithful. Him and Sarah had to be faithful. Look at what God done with Noah. Hey, Noah, there's going to be a flood. Yeah, well, when? Well, I'll determine the due season. The Bible lets us know that Noah preached for 120 years, and it appears he worked on the ark for 80 years, but he preached for 120 years. That's a long time for a flood to be coming. But he said, be faithful, endure, and you'll be all right. Jeremiah the same way, Isaiah the same way. David, he's anointed king as a young shepherd boy, a teenager. He's anointed king of Israel. My goodness, when's it ever going to take place? He has to go through all kinds of situations in order to get to that promise. But God's promise was sure. It stayed. He that endureth to the end, Jesus said, shall be saved. That's what Jesus said. He that endureth, that means that there's some endurance on this, isn't there? There's some things. Let me give you a little reflection on this, and then I've got just two thoughts on this, but I want us to share, and then we're going to have these. Now here, you know, sometimes God chooses losers. If you're a loser, well, maybe that sometimes can be a good point. Now I'm talking about the worldview losers. You know, and I will tell you this right here, my opinion. I think it's God that keeps our president intact. I don't know of any other man in the world that could stay intact with all of the, you know, they've hired a whole god of witches to put curses upon him, hired people to kill him. They've tried to do everything they can, and it keeps going on. Now I think God has to do something with that. And here's what I came up with. How many's ever heard of President Hayes? Anybody know anything about him? Nah, we don't. We've heard of him, but we don't know that much about him. President Taft. How many's ever heard about him? The biggest thing that ever happened, as far as I'm concerned, about him is he come to Taft, California. And probably the town was named after him. During the oil deal, it was a community that he came. But how many's ever heard of Abraham Lincoln? How many's ever heard of that president? Well, let me give you just kind of a biography of his life. He's a loser. A real loser.
No, you're right.
He started a business in 1831 and went bankrupt. He then thought, well, I'll run for the legislature in 1832 and lost. Then he thought, I'll go back into business in 1833. Bellied up again. He certainly wasn't a businessman. In 1836, because things were so bad, he had a nervous breakdown. In 1838, he thought, well, I'll run for political office again. So he ran for speaker. He failed in that, got defeated. He ran for election in 1840, and he lost that election. He ran for Congress in 1843, lost that. He ran for Congress in 1848, 5 years later, lost that. He ran for the Senate in 1855. Now, I've been given up somewhere down here.
Yeah.
You know. In 1855, he ran for the Senate, and he got defeated in that. So he thought, the next year, I'll run for vice president. He was vice president with the election president that year, 1856. And he lost that. Well, in 1858, he thought, well, I'll run for the Senate again. There was an opening. In 1858, he got defeated again. Now, folks, we're talking about a man that you could put loser in front of, and you would have one of the greatest presidents we ever had. In 1860, he got so used to losing, that when he ran for president, someone came up to him and said, Mr. Abraham Lincoln, you think you can win this election? He said, well, he said, Douglas is a northerner, and South won't vote for him. Stephen is a southerner, and North won't vote for him. He said, there's only one man that can defeat me, Abraham Lincoln. But he went on and won that election.
Yes, he did.
You see, when we realize that, yeah, we can do nothing without God, but we just keep working and keep it going and keep it trying and don't give up. Don't give up, and I'll tell you what, one of these days, we're going to win. Just don't give up. God's people don't give up. God needed a strong president during the Civil War.
Yes.
And so God brought Abraham Lincoln in. You know, another big loser in the world, and I understand they got a movie out on him now, is Churchill. He lost about everything good. Lost in school. He was a terrible student. I mean, he was a real loser, Winston Churchill. But as far as I'm concerned, he is the greatest leader during World War II of any of the world leaders. Marvelous man. God placed him right where he wanted him in order for us to maintain our liberty and our freedom, even though he was over Britain. But yet God can take you and I and use us anywhere. I'd like for our singers to come and think about this. It's not because of who we are. We have an idea that, or sometimes we think, well, I'm this. No, Christ is the one that gives strength and validity to us. Or without Christ, we can do nothing. How many believe that?
Yes.
Listen to this beautiful song.